Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quorum Podcast. This is where academic medicine meets remote, austere, and resource-limited areas. Welcome back to the program. This is Aebhric O'Kelly. This week, we are with Dr. Jamie Riesberg, who recently retired from the Army and continues to push for prolonged field care. Jamie, welcome to the program.
Aebhric, thanks for having me.
So, tell us about yourself and what's keeping you busy.
Well, I tell you what, I born and raised in Colorado, so as I had the opportunity to leave and retire from the Army, we chose to come back there. I love the opportunity to raise my kids. I've got a boy that's 8 and one that's 12, raising them in the mountains like I was raised, skiing, hunting, fishing, climbing, whitewater rafting, that kind of stuff. So we're back there settling in, doing some of that. So it's good.
I definitely understand why you decided to go back and plant roots there after your time in the Army.
Yeah, thank you. Not a bad place to be. And I tell you, it's nice. It's weird thinking that you're not going to move again in 2 years. So that takes some getting used to.
So you have quite of an illustrious career. So for people who don't know the Jamie, what did you do for the Army? What has been keeping you busy for the last few decades?
Well, GWOT, the global war on terror. Obviously, my entire 24 years in the Army was influenced or directly in support of our GWOT operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And I think what happened with me, Aebhric, there was this weird confluence of how I grew up, being on volunteer ski patrol, whitewater raft guiding, and seeing medicine in the woods, right? Trauma in the woods in remote environments, and then seeing this amazing trauma system that the US and NATO created in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the point where Secretary of Defense Gates could say in 2009, "Hey, I want every service member to reach a surgeon in under 1 hour," and we made it happen as a system, and that's phenomenal. But I think this weird confluence happened where I looked at that and I said, this isn't what we're doing isn't really medicine anymore. Medics and doctors and frontline providers, it's much more just stabilization. And we're forgetting that there's a lot more that's going to follow after we do the initial treatments on these patients. And so it was really cool in 2013 when a bunch of the NATO special operations folks got together. It was either in Mons or Brussels, Belgium, and they said, we think there's going to be this thing where we no longer have helicopters arriving within 15 minutes of injury. And we think that's going to be really what the future of all military medicine looks like. That you're not going to have these helicopters floating around and you're not going to have surgery in less than 1 hour. And that this was really just a speed bump in the road. And for me, as a kid who grew up in the woods, doing medicine in the cold and snow and hour-long toboggan rides just to get to the base of the ski area, I said, I agree with that. And I think I think there's a whole bunch of skills that our medics are losing because we've gotten so used to 15-minute medevac.
It's interesting that came up in Brussels, that came up in Europe, because there's a long history here in Europe of unconventional warfare medicine. The Forrest brothers in World War II, and then the Cold War also had something like this. So these guys saw back in 2013 that this immediate medicine, which is the peak, isn't it? It's fantastic. 10 minutes after injury, you're on a helicopter with possibly a doc and medics and nurses and anesthetic. I mean, that is the best of the best, but that is not going to be the case in the future. And so you heard this in 2013 in Europe.
Yes, yes. And, I'll name drop a little bit here because folks on your podcast may recognize Dan Irizarry. Dan was just a dynamic family medicine doctor. He was running I forget what the branch division under NATO Special Operations was, but it was basically the NATO Special Operations medical training programs where they were starting to build the surgical teams, right, for a lot of the Western European countries. And Dan noticed the same thing. He said, we've gotten really lazy, even on these surgical teams. They're under the impression, hey man, I'm just going to provide a stabilizing surgery. This is just DCS, damage control surgery, and then I'm moving this patient along in the evac chain. And I don't have to think about wound care, wound vacs, anything 72 hours post injury because they're going to evacuate.
Do you think that's where the whole concept of the NATO SOCM course came from?
I do. I really do. There again another confluence. So the Nordics had been doing a phenomenal job with the Nordic SOCM course, and Aebhric, you probably remember that. The Norwegians and Swedes were, and I believe the Danes too.
Yeah, Pack from Denmark was part of that as well.
Yeah, Pac was very involved in that initially, and they had recognized, and I think part of that was geography of their own country, and they realized their own EMS, emergency medical services, in their pre-hospital environment was such that they're never going to have this golden hour. So they realized as countries early on that weather and terrain were always going to constrain golden hour stuff, and it wasn't their reality. So they created a combat medic course that reflected that. That was just my take as an outsider. But I think it provided the seeds for what then happened in Fullendorf at ISTC to create really for the whole alliance a common standard, which was brilliant.
And you were part of that as well, because that's where you and I first met when we were teaching on the NSOCM course in 2016.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, with Doc Juliana and John Christensen and the whole crew there. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And you remember, Averick, the early days of that were fantastic because you had so many different national caveats about what these medics could and couldn't do. But NATO SOCM sort of took all of that and said, hey, let's push the limits and really teach these folks good medicine. So even if their national laws constrain them, they at least know what the medicine is, even if they're not allowed under their law. But when they're in a combat environment, of course, we know sometimes that stuff changes.
It enhanced interoperability, which here in NATO and EU, we need that because so many different countries were coming to NSOCM, and we had people who weren't allowed to even touch a casualty back at home. Now they're doing the 26 weeks in SOCM, and they're going back to Romania with all these advanced skills and having no place within their framework. But because of NATO, at least whilst they're in the military, they could act on some of these advanced skills they were taught.
Phenomenal, right, Abrick? And again, it's all about taking it to the next level, giving intelligent, motivated people some additional skills and knowledge that allows them to thrive. And I think NATO SOCM did that. It showed a lot of the different countries had very different pre-hospital protocols and laws. But I think this was the crack in the hard shell of some of this dogma in these countries to say, you know what, our medics and our paramedics are really smart people. And given the chance and some appropriate training, they can thrive outside these rigid protocols.
So you were in Germany as SOCUR, or were you 10 Special Force Group surgeon?
So yes, that was all in association with Special Forces Command. My work there was not under the SOCUR, although they supported a lot of that. This was all in association with 10th Group and their mission, supporting, of course, the alliance and European security.
So, Jamie, the transition from GWAT to the coming conflict, the LISCO or the unconventional medicine, how have you seen that change? How to relearn what we were doing in special forces in the 80s and 90s, which was all focused on Soviet, funnily enough. And then GWAT happened and everything changed. Everyone's focusing on massive hemorrhage, airway, and respiratory and ignoring everything else, ignoring DNBI, ignoring my passion of Trop Med. So you have helped change that, evolve this concept from out of the mindset of GWAT. How has that been?
Yeah, well, first off, Aberg, I've been nothing more than, I think, a mouthpiece or a spokesman for what a lot of really smart medics realized many years ago. And I think, part of what I had the privilege of doing, I got to go and teach at the Special Operations Combat Medic course. I was the course director there at Fort Bragg for a couple of years. And what was cool about that is there was alliance members there. We had a lot of international students, and then we had Navy, U.S. Navy, Army, and Marines, so MARSOC, Marine Special Operations Command, all attending that course. And what we all realized was we teach them medicine that really was fundamental to what Green Berets had learned in Vietnam, the medical lessons learned from Vietnam. What's interesting, right? You think about air mobile cavalry, and the first time we really used helicopters with great effect on the battlefield in the Vietnam era, as well as rapid medical evacuation. And that colored our entire development of special operations medicine. So even, and you won't find this written anywhere. I've looked, Aebhric. There was this 72-hour patient hold standard for special operations medics, right? For the Green Beret medic.
Wow.
Oh yeah, 18 deltas. They can hold a patient no matter how sick they are, no matter how burned they are, for 72 hours. Where did that come from? Where did this random 72 hours come from? And I've looked, Aebhric, and I cannot find that in our doctrine. And so the only thing I'm driven to on that conclusion is this was something that evolved out of Vietnam and then the Cold War years, where we said, we think that's about how long it's going to take us to really relieve these Role 1 capabilities of their casualties. So there was this idea, we never really put it into doctrine, but there was this idea that our medics would have to hold really sick patients, trauma or DMBI, disease non-battle, for probably 3 days before we'd be able to get them out. GWOT came and flipped the table on that, right? Because we created this amazing, outstanding trauma system where you could be on a surgical table with world-class surgery, trauma surgery, in under 20 minutes at certain points in Iraq. Like if you were wounded in Iraq, you would arrive at a level 1 trauma capability faster than you would if you were shot right next to a level 1 trauma center in the United States. Right? Phenomenal system. Intensive care in the air, the critical care air transport teams. I mean, just phenomenal capabilities. And what happened? We got lazy. We forgot 30 to 40 years of lessons learned that said special operations medicine in particular will never have this level of evac. It's where this idea of the hold a patient for 3 days came from and what we always taught in the course. The problem is everything our medics were experiencing told them the opposite. Push the button, 15 minutes later, package your casualty, and they're gone. And that's all you have to worry about is being able to call a good 9-miler. You can see the collision course there.
Indeed. Last week I was teaching ultrasound to some SF guys here in Europe, and they just kept saying that I'm only going to do MANR, massive hemorrhage, airway, and respiratory. So why do I need ultrasound? Why do I need DNBI? Why do I need wound cleaning? And it kind of hit me right in the head. Like this is what SF. My understanding of what SF is like. This is what we did in the 80s and 90s. Is the prolonged care, and now what is it? 2 years, 3 years after GWAT, and people still aren't getting this concept.
Yes. And you know how it is. Their teachers and their teachers' teachers have only experienced one thing for the last 20 years. That's rapid medical evacuation, rapid clearance of the battlefield. Now, don't get me wrong. If we can clear the battlefield rapidly of casualties and have robust evacuation and a great trauma system, awesome. But I think we need to open our eyes to the current world environment, look at how drone warfare has evolved and is evolving by the hour in Ukraine. Like what happened last week is no longer valid this week in terms of tactics, techniques, and procedures. Rapid evolution of technology on the battlefield is going to absolutely constrain any kind of aeromedical system that we create. It's just the facts. And I know we've got brilliant people working on unmanned UAV CASEVAC, where you can, load a patient in an unmanned vehicle and it flies them. Great stuff. But again, I think anything in the air we have to assume is probably not going to be our reality in future conflict. Either due to distance, if you look at the Pacific and the PACOM theater, those distances constrain air. One of my favorite stories, this was a great one from War on the Rocks. I don't know, you might have seen this. It was 2006. and a US F-16 pilot punches out way, way out in the Pacific. I think he was 500 nautical miles east of Okinawa. So probably flying out of Kadena Air Base. They were doing some operations, had a catastrophic failure of the engine, punches out. Pilot's safe. He's down in the water. And the US Air Force looks at the Navy and says, well, hey, go get our guy. And the Navy says, well, you're 500 miles out in the middle of the Pacific. We don't have anything out there right now. You guys are the Air Force. Don't you have something to fly out there? And they're like, no, we only have rotary to pick, downed airmen out. And so this was a little bit of a black eye for the pararescue community, right? Because they're like, well, this is our raison d'etre, right? This is our bread and butter. You know what ended up happening with that case, Aebhric?
I don't remember this.
We called the Japanese embassy. We phoned a friend. The Japanese still had an entire fleet of seaplanes. And so they basically flew one of their large ocean capable seaplanes out, landed that aircraft on the water, grabbed our pilot, and flew back to Tokyo.
Wow.
And the US looked at this, and it was amazing because we divested of everything amphibious, all of our seaplanes, fairly quickly after World War II. And we had nothing in the Navy, Marine, or US Air Force inventory that could land on water. Nothing. Because we'd become so dependent on rotary. Our assumption was if we had casualties in the water, we were going to have a aircraft carrier group or something with rotary capability nearby. So again, this was 2006. This happened. I don't think it got as much attention as it deserved. And kudos to our allies, the Japanese, for loaning us an amphibious seaplane to go save our guy. But I use this as an example to say not only are we stronger together, interoperability, but I think we need to think about developing capabilities for medicine that complement each nation's capabilities and cultures, right? Like in the US, we just said, hey, we don't need seaplanes anymore. That's changing, by the way, from what I hear. They're looking at an amphibious version of, believe it or not, the C-130.
Wow.
Because of these sorts of things and looking at the Pacific and some of the tensions in the Taiwan Strait.
So we need to learn from the past. We need to see what our current problems are, and we need to extrapolate to the future. And I think SOMA 2013, 2014 was kind of a turning point in austere medicine. So I only got there in 2014. With 2013, you were there as well, and Paulos, and you guys had that first discussion. Tell us about how did that change happen? How did that spark of prolonged field care start and gain traction?
Yeah, great medics. Great medics is the spark, and it always will be, Aebhric. I think for us as doctors, as physicians, a lot of times we forget that what makes our militaries great, and I include the alliance, all of our allies, and sometimes many of our partner nations as well, is our enlisted folks and their ability to think outside the box. So it was fascinating to me in 2014. So this PFC idea is starting to percolate through NATO Special Operations, and then it hits SOMA, the Special Operations Medical Association, at one of the conferences. This is where, I'll go and fight with the commander all day long to get funding and support to send medics to things like SOMA, because this is a chance to get them all together, have a drink or two, and create solutions to wicked complex problems. So just like that, 2014, all of this conversation's happening at SOMA, and a former civilian paramedic who is now an Army Special Operations medic, Green Beret, but had an extensive experience as an offshore, like on oil rigs, out in the Pacific, Northern Pacific. He had a list of things that kept him awake at night as a paramedic working on an oil rig out on one of these huge platforms out in the middle of the ocean. And he knew that oftentimes with storms, high seas, it might be hours or days before he could get a critically injured or ill casualty off the platform in the middle of the ocean. So he had this list. And what was interesting about his list was it was not, this wasn't like, I need to have these skills to do this. The original list was things like acute coronary syndrome, greater than 30% burns, electrocution, envenomation, like the the great myth and lore of sea snakes, that kind of stuff. So he had this list of stuff, and then he said, what would I as a paramedic need to keep these patients alive for days, possibly up to a week, that I don't currently know? What are the things I'm rusty on? And out of that, so this was Justin Ball, out of that were born the 10 capabilities. That was Justin and Paul and Chris Moore and a bunch of really smart paramedics and 18 Deltas sitting down going, we think these are all the things like patient monitoring, being able to do some advanced surgical procedures. How do you move beyond just the initial airway management to managing ventilation? These are all things that we think are 10 capabilities that you need to keep a sick patient alive when your evac doesn't show up. And that's how PFC was born. It really wasn't looking at the military problem set, Aebhric. It was some smart civilian paramedicine that had then converged with the military problem of we're not always going to have 15-minute medevac.
So the original concept of PFC started there, and there's a huge conversation that happened at each SOMA, but as well as in between the SOMA, and then the JTS came off with a guideline, a CPG, and you were instrumental in leading that change from PFC to PCC. Can you explain that?
Yeah, Aebhric, I love this one. And I'd love your wisdom on this as well, or any of your podcast listeners. So hopefully this can be a dialogue. So think about our original definition of prolonged field care. It was tied to a minimum capability of the special operations combat medic. The belief was, and again, this was 2013, 2014, that really you couldn't do prolonged field care unless you had a solid enough foundation in medicine to understand the principles and the pathophysiology. We believe that was tied to direct patient contact. And that's why in the original definition of prolonged field care, it was activities conducted by us and special operations. It was originally NATO's special operations combat medic or higher capability. Why? Because that's the first level of medic in our alliance where those medics actually touch patients as part of their training. They rotate through trauma centers, they have hands-on patient care, so they understand what disease and trauma look like in a living, breathing human being. So we tied that to that minimum capability very intentionally early on. What happened was, as the Department of Defense caught on to this, and they did very quickly, from 2014, Special Operations formalizes this thing called PFC, and in 2016, the Joint Staff Pentagon level, right, then publishes the capabilities-based analysis, a CBA. I don't want to lose everybody in all the jargon and policy, but those are the documents that basically provide funding and the thou shalt train mandate. So 2016, the Joint Surgeons released this CBA that says prolonged field care is a thing. We're not always going to have golden hour medevac. We need to train the entire force, not just special operations, the entire force in prolonged field care. Here's the problem, Aebhric. The entire force, in their basic training, in their initial medical training, the regular conventional combat medic does not touch a live patient before they graduate, right? They graduate as EMT basics, but all of their training is done on plastic, on simulations. They do not rotate through trauma centers. They do not touch actual sick patients. So how do you then take a concept that was rooted in good medicine with people seeing sick patients as part of their training and then say, nope, everybody can do it? You don't. Those two are mutually incompatible. So fortunately, I have some brilliant mentors, Stacy Shackelford, Monty, just some of the great minds at the Joint Trauma System said, how do we retool this concept to make it for the whole force, not just for special operations? And out of that, prolonged casualty care, PCC, was born. So PFC, a very simple way of understanding the difference in these is PFC is a capabilities-based approach, right? It's special operations. Here's the 10 capabilities you need. PCC is rooted in tactical combat casualty care. So prolonged casualty care is just the next thing that happens after you complete your march pause in tactical combat casualty care. So while it was never designed to be protocolized, we had to create a protocolized approach that matched what the rest of the force knew, which was T tri C. So what we did was say, okay, T tri C, and then your T tri C ends and your medevac doesn't show up. What do you do now? Now you're in prolonged casualty care. Let's give these folks pre-hospital focused. Let's give them the skills, hopefully, they need to take care of these patients until they can get them evacuated.
So I have been incorrect, and I've, well, with a bit of mirth behind it, said that PFC wasn't accepted because the Navy didn't do anything in the field, and you had to convert the concepts of PFC for the Navy so they would accept the prolonged casualty care where they wouldn't accept prolonged field care. It's good to know the actual reason on why you changed that.
Well, and in truth, Aebhric, you're not wrong. That was a discussion that was had. And of course, think of our joint trauma system. Many of our top level leaders are Navy folks. Frank Butler, who chaired the committee for many years, is a Navy captain. And then some of our great trauma surgeons now, I'm thinking of a lot of the folks whose names are on these latest issues of guidelines and CPGs. Great Navy surgeons. The funny part about this is, the irony is, the United States Navy has been doing prolonged field care since 1775, right? Like, it's inherent in shipboard medicine that you're going to have to hold on to a really sick patient that should be on shore, right? Getting fixed facilities care, but they're stuck on your ship.
So I understand now that the concept of PCC is based off of TCCC, and PFC is still capabilities based, still Green Beret based concepts of patient care.
That's right. Yeah. And the tension is this, right? Because is T tri C a protocol, right? Is tactical combat casualty care a protocol? Well, everybody would argue with you, no, it's not. It's guidelines. But that's not true, Aebhric, because the way we have applied it to the entire force, right? And even to our nations where we work and we train partner forces, it's the protocol. It's what you do. And so PFC was never designed to be protocolized medicine. It was designed to teach capabilities to take care of sick people. But you still had to know enough medicine to know when to apply the capability, right? And what to do with, for example, monitoring. Patient monitoring is one of our core 10 capabilities in PFC. Well, great, you can monitor the patient. Now what? You've identified a trend, but do you have enough medical knowledge with what's happening with that trend in their vitals to make the next decision? Which led to another PFC capability, right? The ability to call, phone a friend, and do telemedicine. Well, I may not be the smartest guy in the room. Let me call somebody who can maybe help me with this trend. But when we talked about this for the conventional force and we looked at our future conflict, large scale combat, World War II level casualties, are those capabilities, those Big Ten capabilities, going to be valid for the conventional force? No, absolutely not. Because not every combat medic at the platoon level is going to have the ability to call up to their doctor. That's not reality. They're not going to be able to do telemedicine, nor are they trained necessarily to do it. So that's where we had to retool and ground it in something that actually already existed and was already supported, more importantly, financially and otherwise, by commanders, and that was tactical combat casualty care.
I see the difference, and I see that PCC is embedded deeply into TCCC, and with the website on deployed medicine has the PCC standards and protocols that just match perfectly with TCCC. And I guess the hope is these ASM medics or CMC medics or 68 whiskeys are doing the March Pause L and then immediately starting PCC or Hitman or whatever mnemonic that they come up with, but very often they're not.
Yeah, and why is that, Aebhric? Why is this? Is it just dogma? Is it? I really think it's the teacher's teacher problem. Like right now we have senior medics or folks that have recently retired that are teaching what they saw for 20 years in GWOT in Iraq and Afghanistan. The problem with that is, and it's look, we're all guilty of this as human beings. What's the old saying? Generals always fight the last war,
Mm.
especially if they won, right? So we're always looking at our last war. But let's look back further than that. Let's look back at our last 200 or our last 500 years. And the reality is you're never going to clear the battlefield as quickly as you want, right? It's just never going to happen. The right answer is clear the battlefield, get the casualties to the level of care they need. But when we look at our current operating environment and we look at the lessons from Ukraine, is that ever going to happen? I don't think so. I think part of what our adversaries are doing very effectively is constraining, they're fixing our maneuver force. And we're going to talk a little tactics and strategy here. This isn't necessarily medical, but what do casualties do? They fix the fighting force. So when you've got a bunch of wounded, you're stuck. You can't maneuver. Well, for a combat commander, that's terrible, right? That puts them in a bad situation because maneuver is how you win. That's how you win the fight. But if you're stuck, you're fixed because of these casualties, you've got a problem. So there's two answers to that, right? Ethically, at least, there's two ways to solve the I'm fixed by my casualties problem. One of them is clear them, evacuate them. The other one is treat them to such a degree that you can continue to move your force and you either leave those casualties in place until they can be evacuated, but you're not leaving them and denying them care. You're still providing some level of care that allows them to survive, but you're still also allowing your maneuver force, your healthy force, to continue to go forward and win the fight. Does that make sense at all?
It does. And looking at the current conflict that's happening now here in Europe, the casualties are often stuck for 18 hours at a time because of lack of air superiority, lack of resources, and and the massive amount of drones that are out there waiting for anything to move. So you're absolutely right. These maneuvering units are stuck with their casualties whilst they're trying to get them out to stabilization points. And right now the Ukrainians have adapted a bit, and now they have tons of CMC level or CLS level medics in trucks that will just come and do M, A, and R, throw them in the back of the truck and run, and that would leave the unit there to continue maneuvering. But that's not the best medicine, is it?
No. But again, solution born out of necessity, right? They don't have any other options at this point. And gosh, man, we were looking at talking with some of our friends in Ukraine at the attrition of their medics, their combat medic level, because those folks are being intentionally targeted
Hmm.
by the adversary as well. So when you're intentionally targeting medical capability, either ambulances or the medics themselves, and that Red Cross or that Red Crescent no longer means anything. The Geneva Conventions have gone out the window. We need to be paying very close attention to that because that should change not just how we approach medicine on the battlefield, but our entire doctrine.
Teaching in Ukraine this summer, we saw that they have accepted the PCC guidelines found on the TCCC. They have their own Ukrainian TCCC website, tccc.org.ua, and everything's translated into, well, it's English and Ukrainian. It's fantastic. And they are hungry, they are eager to embrace the PCC protocols when they sit on their casualty for a while, but it's difficult. It's constrained by light discipline. It's just constrained by supplies. But they're doing what they can, and they're improvising as best as they can.
Yeah, Aebhric, this is a great example of why, again, brilliant medics. This wasn't Jamie Riesberg or Sean Key or anybody else, right? This was just brilliant medics and paramedics coming up with minimum, better, best. And so you'll see that still in the guidelines, right? Is this minimum, better, best idea because of the environment gets the majority of the vote in combat. The enemy gets a vote, the environment gets a huge vote. Night, darkness, weather, you know, gosh, think of trench warfare now that we're seeing again in Ukraine and trying to do good medicine in a trench in 3 inches of mud and water in 38 degrees, right? Even your quote unquote healthy fighters are already operating at probably, 30% degradation due to cold feet, hypothermia. So you're never going to practice hospital level medicine. And this is probably the greatest thing to get across is we have become so super specialized in our Western healthcare systems with our hospitals and everything else. We've forgotten that there's a whole segment of medicine and there's a whole population right now in and out of combat, right? The rural environments, this is why Nordic SOCM, I think, led the way. You look at those far north environments and they realize, no, we're never going to have hospital level medicine for a lot of these folks. The right answer is evacuate them, get them to the hospital level medicine. But if you can't, what do you do? And so you do the minimum. You do the minimum thing you can, and maybe the environment allows you to get to better or best. But that's why that's always inherent in those guidelines, because the environment gets the largest point of the vote on the medicine.
Mm.
And my hope is, God help us, Aebhric, when the lawyers get a hold of these cases, right? Because the lawyers are going to say, well, the standard of care is this, right? And they're going to throw all kinds of things out there from the hospital. The problem is, and you and I know this so well, austere medicine, not hospital medicine. And so how do you change it? How do you change it and say, we're not just going to do cowboy medicine. We want to do good medicine, and we want it to be grounded in these principles. And that, to me, was the beauty of prolonged field care. As we said, here are 10 capabilities you need to be really proficient at in order to do good medicine in really bad environments.
That is a challenge. And at the special forces level with PFC, we have patient contact time, we have sustainment training, we have hopefully a hunger and to learn whilst in the team room doing paperwork and still getting on websites and learning. But how is this? What about the guy on the ground? What about the CMC or the 68 whiskey that maybe he's done the bit of PFC learning? How do they enhance that themselves? How do they prepare for the fact that we need hospital-based medicine in the trenches?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right. And Aebhric, I think what you're driving at, and your listeners know this very well. If you're going to take care of sick patients, you need to see sick patients. Like it's just a fundamental axiom in medicine. We can teach great courses. We can give guys 5 days of an amazing mind dump of great medicine. But if they're not actually seeing patients and touching patients, it's going to be really hard to keep those skills up. And I myself am guilty of this, like just in my time since I've retired, I haven't been working clinically as actively as I would like. And we know you get rusty. So my challenge to these medics would be, look, if you're going to find yourself in those situations, even if it's just going and working urgent care and you can't get into an emergency department, go ask if you can ride along with the ambulances, if you can just observe. It's funny, medical schools now, back in the old days, they called it candy striping, right? Where you just go and you change the sheets. You were a volunteer, Red Cross volunteer, and you'd rotate through the hospital and you'd change sheets. But that was a great experience. That's how I started as, a high schooler with my first exposure to medicine. I said, hey, this medicine thing's kind of interesting. And I wasn't putting chest tubes in, but I was there bedside while the doctors were doing that. And I saw what happened to these patients over the next couple hours as they're in the emergency department. And so I think we need not constrain our medics by saying, oh, you can't go touch patients. You're going to just go see sick call and do this other stuff. But we should open opportunities. And that's really where we want to try and partner with our neighborhood community hospitals and our trauma centers. And this needs to happen all over Europe, by the way.
Mm.
These medics go to NATO SOCM. They go back to their countries. They plug in with their physicians, and their physicians bring them to the emergency department, emergency theater, operating theater, and they have opportunities that even if they can't because of law do hands-on, they can at least observe and see and watch how these patients flow through from surgery to recovery to a day or two later how their wounds are healing. If they're not able to do this and see and volunteer and just be in these environments, it's going to be really hard to do prolonged care.
That is the challenge in getting these guys with operational tempos of being gone 9 months of the year. And we're asking them now to spend time touching patients. It's a challenge. And when I was on the ODAs, I would volunteer on the weekends to be in the base hospital and just to take vital signs or to be there and do cannulations or be a fly on the wall as the doc was doing all of his advanced level stuff. And that's helpful. But I didn't have a family. I can imagine the medics on the ground, they have a family and like, well, I can't leave on the weekends. I've got to, deal with the household, and so unless this is part of their work, it's definitely a challenge to get that hands on. But I agree with you. That's kind of what separates the PFC operator from the PCC operator.
Yes, yeah. And Aebhric, that was one of the things at the two-star level, as I was, and I failed miserably at this, but advocating for policy relief. And what I mean by that, that's a Washington, D.C. term, but basically deburden the medics and the SF teams, or even unconventional at our squad level. Let's deburden them of all these other baloney requirements that really aren't going to make them better warriors. And let's focus on the basics: shoot, move, communicate, and survive. Right? How did the 75th Ranger Regiment achieve zero preventable deaths on the battlefield? How did they do that under Russ Cotwall's leadership as the 75th Regimental Surgeon? They did that because the commander supported continuous training every quarter. So that means every 3 months, those medics were recertifying not only the medics, but the combat lifesavers, and even just at the squad level, being able to show they're proficient in tourniquet application, taking care of these patients. So until it becomes commander's business, we're not going to get the policy relief that allows these medics the time to really keep the skill set up. And you're right, we've got a number of band-aids, right? We call it non-trauma modules, or we call it medical proficiency training, where it's in policy that our medics on the special operations side have to continue to go and touch patients. But man, that's a bare minimum. If all you have to do is 1 month every 4 years in a trauma center, is that enough to keep your skills up? No, that's a bare minimum. We should be shooting for the best, which is getting these guys every month, sometimes weekly, touch points with patients. I'll throw one of our groups under the bus here because they're doing a great job with it. Uh, they did a partnership with their local city level 1 trauma center. And the medics, after they go and do a medical proficiency training, they keep their badge. And then they can just show up. They contact the shift supervisor and they can show up in the emergency department and do ride alongs with the ambulance. They can work a shift in the ER doing vitals, putting lines in, doing wound care, stabilizing, and it's on their time. They're just like, hey man, I'm feeling a little rusty. I'm going to go take 4 hours and go float through the emergency department on a Friday night. And you know what? They're going to see some good trauma. They're going to see some sick patients. So I think that's the answer. And my hope is we could get policy relief. The problem is the lawyers will never go for this because of risk aversion. It's scary to put a medic, a combat medic, a military person, and give them a hospital badge, and they haven't done the 200 plus hours of onboarding and training and all the other legal requirements. So we're going to continue to run into red tape. That's unfortunate because these medics need those skills. And if we could provide policy relief, that would make it easy for them to just keep their badge, show up, work a shift, see patients, touch patients, problem solved.
Even if it's an afternoon, the team sergeant's like, all right, your job, your place of duty is to go to that ambulance or go to that hospital, and from 1 till 5, and that's what you're going to do. Go touch patients.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
We looked at the past and we looked at the present. Now let's talk about PFC, PCC in the coming large-scale combat operation. What can we do to mitigate the massive cluster that's coming our way?
Yeah, Aebhric, this is a tough one, and this is one where I hope your listeners and I hope this podcast continues the dialogue. There's a big effort right now underway, led by again some great military medical leaders to talk about expectant casualty management. What do you do with when when you just have so many casualties? A percentage of them aren't going to survive. And how do we give our medics, these 19-year-olds right out of high school with a little bit of medical training, how do we give them the tools to deburden them from that decision of who lives and who dies? I think that's your bare minimum starting point for how we approach large casualty eventualities when we think about future conflict. How do you deburden that medic? What can you give them morally, spiritually, ethically, equip them for life and death decisions? Because Again, going back to, I sound like a broken record, but if you're not seeing sick patients and you're not seeing patients die in the emergency department or in the ICU, it's really hard then to go into the battlefield and watch people die. And so, my prediction would be we're going to have a significant mental health problem in the force if we don't find solutions, especially seeing sick patients. But if we can't have our medics do that, we got to at least give them some tools to do expectant care. So I'm really glad that the Joint Trauma System is embracing that. They're looking at that problem. They're coming up with a guideline for that, as well as mass casualty and triage guidelines that complement tactical combat casualty care and prolonged care. But I think, looking forward, Aebhric, here's the challenge, right? And we alluded to this. Medical is no longer safe, right? That Red Cross, that Red Crescent mean nothing on the future battlefield. So if that's the case, how are we training our medical force to be survivable? And this may be me being guilty as both a physician and a Green Beret, but I believe we need to start training some of our medical people to be survivable. And what that looks like is robust tactical training. So, and again, I'm just throwing that out there to your listeners today. When was the last time you saw a doctor or surgeon who knew how to operate a 240, or even was qualified on their 9mm, right? So these types of things, I think these are hard conversations we need to have, thinking about the fact that now medicine is a target on the battlefield. How do we make medical people more survivable, more robust? And then the third thing on this is, how do we train for what we're seeing, what we're learning from Ukraine and other places right now? What are the medical lessons learned? You alluded to one of them. It's wound care. When was the last time our folks had to take care of a wound that had been festering in a trench for 4 days before they saw it? Never. No one currently has had to deal with that problem, unless they were doing host nation care or missions work, medical missions. So to me, that's the other piece that I think we're missing out on. I think the military needs to be active and aggressive, partnering with NGOs, Médecins Sans Frontières. I know they want nothing to do with the military. They want to remain apolitical. But gosh, man, medicine is medicine. And if we're just taking care of sick people, it would be great for our medics to see that. We tried really hard to get our medics in to rotate in Tanzania with your help and setting that up with our 18 series, because what a great opportunity to see really sick civilian patients days, if not weeks, after their wound had been, after their trauma. And this would be awesome for our future conflict, because we're talking about now strategically planning to hold patients for days, maybe weeks, right? So, so those are all things. Those are all things I think would help partnership with the NGOs, getting our folks in, seeing sick people, deburdening the medic of the ethical and moral challenges that are going to come from large casualty events.
So it sounds to me like, regardless if you're a PFC operator or a PCC operator, it's all about live patient hands-on experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got great courses out there. COROM's got some awesome course offerings, SMS, the AEC course on the civilian side. Here's the funny thing about this, right, Aebhric? We know right now in the United States, 13% of the population is rural, underserved, and cannot reach a hospital in under an hour, let alone get surgery. So that's 13% of our population overall. That's a small percentage of paramedics that need to be doing this kind of concept. But for those paramedics who do, we owe it to them to give them the best solutions possible, right? And give them the tools, the training, the knowledge, and the skills, the sustainment to take care of those patients when those bad days come. It's funny because here in Colorado Springs, the weather always gets a vote, right? The environment gets a vote. And so we've got level 1 trauma center within 20 minutes of the entire metropolitan area. But a huge snowstorm hit a couple of years ago, and we had patients stuck for days. We had pregnant women laboring in their houses. As the crow flies, they were less than 30 miles away from the hospital, but they had to labor and deliver at home. We had sick patients, acute coronary syndromes at home, that were managed remotely because there was 5-foot snow drifts from this massive snowstorm, and nobody could get out there. We were driving snowcats, tracked vehicles out with a maximum speed of 15 to 20 miles per hour to go and get these patients. But again, look at that transport time. That's 6 hours. in a tracked vehicle to go through the snow to get these folks. This is in right now in the United States. So these things happen, and that would be my hope with courses like AEC, is that we continue to build a pool of capability, not just folks that are interested in this medicine, but also really love it and want to get better at it.
So, Jamie, my final questions for you is this, and you just kind of did a bracketing attack on this question already, but what advice do you have for the new medic, the new nurse, new doc who is just starting out on their career in austere medicine?
Yeah, great question. I think my number one advice is stay curious. Just stay curious. Whatever it was that drove them to medicine in the first place, keep that fire burning, keep that lit, because that's going to make you successful as an austere provider. If you're able to be curious and think about the problem different ways, you'll find a way to use the environment to your benefit, right? This is the heart and soul of wilderness medicine. It's like jazz music, right? You have to improvise. You're never going to have all the equipment you want. You're not going to have the hospital wall suction and unlimited oxygen. So what do you do with these patients? And my answer to that is the people that I see that are successful in austere care and prolonged care are the ones that are curious. They stay curious and they stay creative. And the good part about that is even if you don't have the opportunity to touch sick patients, you keep reading, you keep listening to podcasts, and you keep your medical brain sharp.
Good advice. Jamie, thanks for pushing for austere medicine as you have. Thank you for being a mover and shaker in the community. And it's been fantastic to have you a guest on our podcast.
I would say, Aebhric, thank you. Thank you is what I want to say to everybody. I want to thank you for the tremendous work you've done in this problem set. This is complex. It's hard. I alluded to all the policy, the legal stuff, the challenges of seeing and touching live patients and getting those experiential learning. But man, none of this would be happening if it weren't for smart medics and advocates continuing to push for the problem set. So thank you and keep at it. Keep at it because we're going to need it for the next conflict. There's not going to be golden hour. So if we know that's the case, we got to keep fighting to get the best medical training we can.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine. If you would like to earn CPD credits for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credit, free access to our virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on our college website at quorum.edu.mt.